Hi, thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. In this video we're going to read Job 38 and 39 and learn about God's attitude. When life goes awry and we suffer, it's a natural human response to start to question God. We might ask God, why is this happening to me? Sometimes we might try and put God on a guilt trip. We remind God, hey, I did this for you. Why are you allowing me to suffer after everything I've done for you? Sometimes we make demands of God. God, please remove the suffering right now. Or we might give God an ultimatum. God, if you don't remove this suffering, I'm not going to do anything special for you anymore. And again, those are natural human responses. And that's how Job responded to his suffering. Job questioned God. He tried to put God on a guilt trip. He made demands of God. But what we're going to read in Job 38 and 39 is God's response to Job. These chapters are God's response to all of Job's questions and his demands. And what we're going to see is that God did not appreciate Job's attitude. God did not appreciate being questioned that way. And so what we learn from this is we need to be very careful how we treat God. It's okay to ask God questions, but we should not make demands of God and give Him ultimatums. Now let's set everything in context. This is a timeline of world history. We're out here around 2000 AD. Here we have the birth of Christ. This red bar represents the Old Testament from creation up to the end of the Old Testament period, around 400 BC. This little blue box represents the New Testament. Here we have some of the major Old Testament characters: Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, Daniel, and Jesus. These bars here represent the groups of Old Testament books. Job probably lived sometime around 2000 BC, and so that puts him very early in the overall story of the Old Testament. Now let's review the life of Job and Job's story found in the book of Job. The chapters we're going to read today are represented by this purple box here. This is Job 38 and 39, so you see we're getting very close to the end of the book. At the very beginning of the book, we're told that Job was very upright and also that he was very wealthy. Then we're told that Satan was given permission to test Job and destroy all of Job's possessions. Satan also killed Job's children and afflicted Job with boils. And Job passed the test. Job did not curse God like Satan thought that he would or accused Job. However, Job did not understand why all this suffering happened to him and why he suddenly lost everything. And Job had some friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and they didn't understand why all this happened either. And so there was a long discussion then between these four men about why Job was suffering the way he was and why he had lost everything. These three men believed that Job was suffering because he had sinned. Job insisted that that was not true and that he was innocent. And as this dialogue went on, Job began to question God. And then he tried to put God on a guilt trip and made demands of God. And so before we read Job 38 and 39 and see God's response to all of this, let's review some verses through here just to refresh our memory of what it is that Job was saying to God throughout this dialogue. So let's start with Job chapter 7, verse 16. And this is Job speaking. I waste away, I will not live forever. Leave me alone, for my days are but a breath. What is man that you magnify him, and that you are concerned about him? Now this is Job speaking to God. And notice this phrase here, leave me alone. And again, this was after Job was suffering. And Job essentially said, and Job believed that God was the one making him suffer. Job believed that God was afflicting him and that God was treating him like an enemy. And so Job essentially said, just leave me alone. And then he asked this very interesting question, what is man that you magnify him? In other words, Job understood that humans are so insignificant compared to God. Job ended up asking God the question, well, if we're so insignificant, why do you even bother with us? Why do you make us suffer this way if we're so insignificant? Then in chapter 10, again, this was Job speaking. Now notice the single quote here. All of this is a quotation of what Job wanted to say to God. Job was actually speaking to his friends, and he told them this is what he wanted to say to God. I will say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know why you contend with me. Is it right for you indeed to oppress, to reject the labor of your hands, and to look favorably on the schemes of the wicked? Now notice the word condemn and contend and oppress and reject. And so again, this reflects Job's feelings toward God. Job believed that God had condemned him, was contending with him, was fighting with him, and rejecting him. And notice Job is trying to put God on a little bit of a guilt trip here. Is it right for God to do this to Job? Later in chapter 10, verse 18, Job said, and Job was speaking to God, "Why then have you brought me out of the womb? Would that I had died and no eye had seen me." And again, this was Job's attitude at this point, that he felt like he would be better off dead. Then in chapter 13, Job said this, "But I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to argue with God." Job believed that if he could stand in front of God and state his case, that that God would be convinced that Job was innocent and that he should not be suffering the way he was suffering. Later in chapter 13, verse 24, Job said this to God, "Why do you hide your face and consider me your enemy?" Notice the word enemy. Job believed that God was treating him like an enemy. Chapter 16, verse 21, Job said this to his friends, "Oh, that a man might plead with God as a man with his neighbor." And again, throughout this dialogue, we see that Job wanted to stand in front of God and state his case and prove that he was innocent and prove that he should not be suffering the way he was suffering. And then chapter 19, verse 6, "Know then that God has wronged me and has closed his net around me." Notice the word wronged. Here Job essentially said that God was in the wrong, that God was wronging Job. Obviously that's a very brazen thing to say. And then chapter 23, verse 3, "Oh, that I knew where I might find God. I would present my case before God and fill my mouth with arguments. Would God contend with me by the greatness of his power? No, surely he would pay attention to me." And so again, we see here this idea that Job wanted to stand in front of God and state his case, and here he was so bold as to say, surely God would listen to Job, surely God would believe what Job had to say. So that gives you an idea of some of the things that Job was saying throughout this dialogue. Now we're going to start with chapter 38, and we're going to read chapter 38 and 39, and this is God's response to Job. Now notice in verse 1, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said." So it states clearly here that Yahweh is answering Job, but Yahweh did not answer Job directly. Job had all these questions, and God did not come back and say, "Okay, here's the answers to your questions." And so as we read through these chapters, I want you to think, what was it that Yahweh was trying to communicate to Job? What lesson was Yahweh trying to teach Job through this? So with that, let's get started. And again, this is Yahweh speaking to Job, chapter 38, verse 2. "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now gird up your loins like a man, and I will ask you, and you instruct me." Now right away, think about what's God's attitude about right now. Well, God's a little bit angry, or maybe a lot angry. Verse 4, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who set the measurements of the earth, since you know? Or who stretched the line on it?" Now here we see God's asking questions, and he's going to do this throughout his speech here. Yahweh's going to ask Job a lot of questions. But notice the sarcasm. "Tell me if you have understanding." And down here he says, "Who set the measurements of the earth, since you know?" We don't normally think of God being sarcastic, but here clearly God is using some sarcasm to communicate to Job. And again, he'll do that throughout this speech. Yahweh's going to use a lot of questions and a little bit of sarcasm. Verse 6, "On what were the bases of the earth sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who enclosed the sea with doors, when, bursting forth, the sea went out from the womb? When I made a cloud its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band? And I placed boundaries on the sea, and set a bolt and doors. And I said to the sea, Thus far you shall come, but no further, and here shall your proud waves stop." Job, Have you ever in your life commanded the morning and caused the dawn to know its place, that the dawn might take hold of the ends of the earth and the wicked be shaken out of it? The dawn is changed like clay under the seal, and the ends of the earth stand forth like a garment. From the wicked the dawn's light is withheld, and the uplifted arm is broken. Job, have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Again, notice a lot of these questions are rhetorical questions, and the answer is no. And Job doesn't know the answer to a lot of these questions. Job, have you understood the expanse of the earth? Tell me, if you know all this. Where is the way to the dwelling of light? In darkness, where is its place? That you may take light to its territory, and that you may discern the paths to the home of light. You know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great. Job, have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of distress, for the day of war and battle? Where is the way that the light is divided, or the east wind scattered on the earth? Who has cleft a channel for the flood, or a way for the thunderbolt, to bring rain on a land without people, on a desert without a man in it? To satisfy the waste and desolate land, and to make the seeds of grass to sprout? Has the rain a father? Who has begotten the drops of dew? From whose womb has come the ice? And the frost of heaven, who has given it birth? Water becomes hard like stone, and the surface of the deep is imprisoned. Job, can you bind the chains of the Pleiades, or loose the cords of Orion? Can you lead forth a constellation in its season, and guide the bear with her satellites? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens, or fix their rule over the earth? Can you lift up your voice to the clouds, so that an abundance of water will cover you? Can you send forth lightnings that they may go, and say to you, here we are? Who has put wisdom in the innermost being, or given understanding to the mind? Who can count the clouds by wisdom, or tip the water jars of the heavens, when the dust hardens into a mass and the clods stick together? Job, can you hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions, when the lions crouch in their dens and lie in wait in their lair? Who prepares for the raven its nourishment, when its young cry to God and wander about without food? Do you know the time the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the deer? Can you count the months they fulfill, or do you know the time they give birth? The deer kneel down, they bring forth their young, they get rid of their labor pains. Their offspring become strong, they grow up in the open field, they leave and do not return to them. Who sent out the wild donkey free? And who loosed the bonds of the swift donkey, to whom I gave the wilderness for a home, and the salt land for his dwelling place? The wild donkey scorns the tumult of the city, the shoutings of the driver he does not hear. The wild donkey explores the mountains for his pasture, and searches after every green thing. Job, will the wild ox consent to serve you? Or will he spend the night at your manger? Can you bind the wild ox in a furrow with ropes, or will he harrow the valleys after you? Will you trust the wild ox because his strength is great, and leave your labor to him? Will you have faith in the wild ox that he will return your grain and gather it from your threshing floor? The ostrich's wings flap joyously with the pinion and plumage of love, for the ostrich abandons her eggs to the earth and warms them in the dust. The ostrich forgets that a foot may crush them, or that a wild beast may trample them. The ostrich treats her young cruelly, as if they were not hers. Though her labor be in vain, she is unconcerned, because God has made her forget wisdom, and has not given her a share of understanding. But when the ostrich lifts herself on high, she laughs at the horse and his rider. The ostrich laughs because the ostrich can outrun the horse. Job, do you give the horse his might? Do you clothe his neck with a mane? Do you make him leap like the locust? His majestic snorting is terrible. The horse paws in the valley and rejoices in his strength. He goes out to meet the weapons. The horse laughs at fear and is not dismayed, and he does not turn back from the sword. The quiver rattles against the horse, the flashing spear and javelin. With shaking and rage, the horse races over the ground, and he does not stand still at the voice of the trumpet. As often as the trumpet sounds, the horse says, "Ha-ha!" and he scents the battle from afar, and the thunder of the captains in the war cry. Job, is it by your understanding that the hawk soars, stretching his wings toward the south? Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high? On the cliff the eagle dwells and lodges, upon the rocky crag an inaccessible place. From there the eagle spies out food, his eyes see it from afar. His young ones also suck up blood, and where the slain are, there is he. Then the Lord said to Job, "Will the fault finder contend with the Almighty? Let him who reproves God answer it." Now, what was Yahweh's point? What was Yahweh trying to teach Job? Yahweh's point was that Job is insignificant, and that God is the creator, and God knows all the answers to these questions, and Job doesn't. And that's how Yahweh was pointing out that he is so very superior to Job. But also remember that this was Yahweh's response to Job's questions and Job's demands. And essentially through this, Yahweh was also saying to Job, don't you dare talk to me like that. Because God's the creator. He has authority. He has the right to do with his creation whatever he wants. And we as humans really don't have the right to question God and make demands of him. And so God essentially says, don't you talk to me like that. Very similar to when children talk back to their parents and the parents say, don't talk to me like that. Or employees should not talk that way to their employers, because the employers by right can say, don't talk to me like that. Now the next few verses are Job's reaction to Yahweh and basically his submission to Yahweh. Let's look at chapter 40, verse 3. Then Job answered the Lord and said, "Behold, I am insignificant. What can I reply to you? I lay my hand on my mouth. Once I have spoken, and I will not answer, even twice, and I will add nothing more." So we see here Job got the point. Notice the word insignificant. Job realized he was insignificant compared to God. Job realized he should not be talking to God like this. Job said, "I will not answer. I will add nothing more. I lay my hand on my mouth." Job got the point that he should not be talking to God like this. Now let me pause and ask a question. Let's review something. Why was Job suffering? Job was suffering because God was trying to make a point to Satan. At the very beginning of the book of Job, we're told that Job was upright and that Job was very wealthy. And there was a dialogue in heaven between Yahweh and Satan, and Yahweh pointed out Job and pointed out how Job was very upright. And Satan said that the only reason Job was following God was because Job was wealthy. Satan said that if you take away Job's wealth, he will curse God. And so Yahweh gave Satan permission to test Job, and that's when Satan went out and destroyed all Job's possessions and killed his children and afflicted him with boils. And so we see that Job was suffering because Yahweh was trying to make a point to Satan. And Yahweh is the one who created everything, including us, and Yahweh created us to serve him. And so in this particular case, God was within his rights to use Job to try and make this point to Satan. And so Job's response to all of this should have been to submit to God and be willing to be a servant of God and allow God to use him however God saw fit. Now, let's look at a few other verses that repeat this idea that we should not talk to God this way. And this is Proverbs 9, verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Notice the word fear. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So we as humans, if we don't fear God, we're not wise. Or if we want to be wise, the starting point, the place that we start, is to fear God. And so in Job's case, Job should have been afraid to talk to God like that. And that was part of Yahweh's point to Job. Yahweh was trying to make Job afraid to talk to him like that. Also, let's look at Isaiah 45, verse 9. Woe to the one who quarrels with his maker, an earthenware vessel among the vessels of earth. Will the clay say to the potter, what are you doing? Obviously, the answer is no. Or will the thing you are making say, he has no hands? And again, the answer is no. And so here, humans are compared to clay, and God is the potter. And so just as a lump of clay is not going to talk back to the potter and say, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Why are you making me like this and not like that? The clay is not going to say that. And likewise, humans should not say that to God. Now, this idea is also repeated in Romans chapter 9. On the contrary, who are you, O man, who answers back to God? The thing molded will not say to the molder, why did you make me like this? Will it? And again, the answer is no. Does not the potter have a right over the clay to make from the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for common use? The answer there is yes. The potter does have that right. So if the potter has a bunch of clay, it's his right to take half of the clay and make an honorable vessel and the other half to make a dishonorable vessel. And the point here is God also has that kind of right over us because he created us. He has authority over us. And so again with Job, God had the authority to use Job to make his point to Satan. And God has the authority to use us in however way he sees fit to serve his purposes. So what we see through this is we should not make demands from God. We should not demand anything from God. And I believe that's where Job got in trouble. He started demanding things from God. I believe it's okay to ask God questions. You know, if we're suffering, I believe it's okay to ask God why we're suffering. But we have to be willing to accept that he may not answer, and we have to be okay with that. So it's okay to ask God. It's not okay to demand that God explain himself because we don't have a right to know why bad things are happening to us. And so all of this tells us what we should not do when we're suffering. What should we do? Well, the proper response to suffering is to submit to God and remember that he's the creator, we are the created thing, he has authority over us, and ultimately we have to submit to God and we have to trust that God knows what he's doing. No matter how bad our suffering is, no matter how bad life gets, God is in control, but God does have authority. He has the right to do with us what he wants, and we have to submit to that and trust that he knows what he's doing. If you'd like to receive the next episode of Bible Mountain via email, please visit www.biblemountain.com, click on follow, and there will be a place to enter your email address and subscribe to my email feed. This is a free subscription and your email will not be sold nor given away. Also, if you like this video, please use the share buttons on your webpage to like it and or share it with your friends. And once again, thank you for watching BibleMountain.com.